I was wrong to think loyalty ran in the blood. I had believed, for 63 years, that the people you love most are the ones who will never let you fall. I built my whole life around that belief. I gave everything I had to protect it. And then, on a Tuesday evening in October, standing in the middle of a room full of people I had known for decades, I understood that I had been mistaken for a very long time. My name is Lorraine Whitfield. I am 63 years old, and I live in a small house on the edge of Kelowna, British Columbia, with a garden that takes up more of my time than it probably should, and a golden retriever named Biscuit, who has no opinion about any of this. I retired 2 years ago from a career in commercial real estate that I had spent 31 years building from nothing. I started as an administrative assistant at a brokerage in Vancouver when I was 24, answering phones and filing paper contracts, and by the time I was 40 I had my own firm. By the time I was 55, that firm had 4 offices across the Okanagan and 17 agents working under my name. I am not telling you this to impress you. I am telling you this so you understand what I had, and what I chose to do with it, and what it cost me. I had one child, a daughter. Her name is Stephanie, and she is 36 years old, and she has her father's eyes and my stubbornness, and for most of her life those two things together made her someone I was genuinely proud of. Her father, my ex-husband Gerald, left when Stephanie was 11. He did not leave badly. There was no screaming, no court battle, no ugliness. He simply decided that the life we had built together was not the life he wanted, and he said so, and he moved to Calgary, and we remained civil. Stephanie spent summers with him and school years with me, and I worked very hard to make sure she never felt the gap his leaving had created. I paid for everything. I want to be honest about that, not as a complaint, but as a fact. I paid for her school supplies and her hockey equipment and her braces and her prom dress. I paid for her undergraduate degree at UBC and the 1 year of graduate school she completed before deciding academia was not for her. I paid the first and last month's rent on her apartment in Penticton when she was 25 and just starting out. I co-signed her car loan. When she met her boyfriend, a man named Derek Pallister, at a friend's barbecue 5 years ago, I paid for the dinner where she brought him home to meet me. I did not keep a running total. That is not why I am listing these things. I am listing them because they matter to what happened later, and because I think you deserve the full picture before you decide what you think of me. Derek worked in sales for a building supply company. He was 39 when Stephanie met him, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that fills a room before the conversation begins. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, which is to say that the charm was very effective, and I did not fully trust it from the beginning. But Stephanie loved him, and he treated her well as far as I could see, and I kept my reservations to myself because she was an adult and it was her life to live. They got engaged 18 months after they met. She called me on a Saturday morning in February, and her voice was the happiest I had heard it in years, and I sat in my kitchen and cried a little after we hung up. Not from sadness, but from something that felt like relief. I thought, she is going to be all right. I thought, I did something right. The wedding was planned for the following October. Stephanie had always wanted a fall wedding. She talked about the colors, burnt orange and deep burgundy, and the venue she had found, a vineyard property outside of Summerland with a view of the lake that she described as the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The venue cost what it cost, and when she mentioned the number to me, carefully, watching my face for a reaction, I told her not to worry about it. I said I would handle the venue and the catering. I said it was my gift to her. Over the following months, I wrote checks and made transfers and coordinated with vendors on Stephanie's behalf when her work schedule got overwhelming. I paid the deposit on the caterer. I paid the florist. I covered the cost of the tent rental when it became clear the evening reception would overflow the indoor space. Derek's parents, a couple named Ray and Susan Pallister who lived in Kamloops, offered to pay for the rehearsal dinner and the bar tab, and I thought that was generous and said so. I thought we were sharing this. I thought we were doing it together. I did not think about credit. I did not think about who would be acknowledged or thanked or recognized. The thought genuinely did not occur to me. I was her mother. This was what mothers did. The week before the wedding, I drove to Summerland to help Stephanie with some final logistics. We spent an afternoon at the vineyard, walking through the layout, and she was happy and distracted in the way brides are supposed to be. And at one point she stopped in the middle of the aisle they had set up between rows of wooden chairs and turned to me and said, "Mum, I don't know what I would have done without you." I told her she would have figured it out. That was what I always told her. The wedding day was genuinely beautiful. I will give it that. The October light came in low and golden over the lake, and the leaves on the hillside were the exact colors Stephanie had wanted, and she looked extraordinary in her dress, which was ivory with a long lace train and buttons down the back that took her 2 bridesmaids 15 minutes to fasten. I stood off to one side and watched her walk down the aisle on Gerald's arm, and I felt something shift quietly in my chest, the way things shift when you understand that a chapter has ended. The ceremony was lovely. The vows were personal and a little funny, and Derek cried, which surprised me and made me think better of him in that moment. Afterward, the photographs took over an hour, and then the reception moved into the tent, and there was the caterer's food, which was excellent, and the flowers, which were everything Stephanie had described, and the lighting, which I had approved and paid for, strung between the tent poles in warm white loops. It was exactly what she had wanted. I sat at my table with my sister, Margaret, and her husband, and 2 of my oldest friends from Vancouver who had driven up for the occasion, and I thought, this is good. This is worth it. The speeches started at 7:30. Derek's best man went first, and he was funny and appropriate and raised his glass, and that was fine. Then one of Stephanie's bridesmaids spoke, and she was warm and a little tearful, and that was fine too. Then Derek's father, Ray, stood up, and he spoke about welcoming Stephanie into the family, and he thanked the guests, and he raised a toast to the couple. He mentioned the rehearsal dinner. He mentioned the bar. He was gracious and brief, and I appreciated it. Then Derek stood up. I remember the exact moment. I remember the way he buttoned his jacket before he took the microphone. I remember how he looked out at the room with that easy confidence and smiled, and I thought for a moment, unreasonably, that he was going to say something that would make me revise everything I had quietly suspected about him. He thanked his parents. He thanked his best man. He thanked the bridesmaids. He talked about the vineyard, how special the venue was, how it had always been Stephanie's dream, and then he said, "And a huge thank you to my parents for making so much of this day possible. Dad, Mum, we could not have done this without you." The room applauded. I sat very still. He kept going. He thanked various friends. He thanked Stephanie's bridesmaids again. He said something touching about Gerald, who was seated across the tent and received the mention with a modest nod. He talked for another 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes he did not say my name. He did not gesture toward my table. He did not say Stephanie's mother, or Lorraine, or her mum, or any variation of any of those things. When he finally raised his glass and said, "To my beautiful wife," the room cheered, and I raised my glass with everyone else, and I smiled, and I set the glass back down, and I looked at the white tablecloth in front of me and thought, very clearly, so that is what we are. My sister Margaret was sitting 2 seats to my left. She leaned over and put her hand on my arm and said nothing. She did not need to say anything. She had heard it too. I looked across the tent at Stephanie. She was laughing at something Derek had just whispered in her ear, her head tilted back, her eyes bright. She had not noticed, or she had noticed and decided it was fine. I could not tell which, and in that moment I could not bear to find out. I stayed for another hour. I danced once, with Gerald of all people, because the band started playing something from the 1980s, and he appeared at my elbow with his hand out, and I thought, why not? He did not mention the speech. He said, "She looks happy." I said, "She does." We left it there. At 9:15, I found Stephanie near the bar and hugged her and told her she was beautiful and that the wedding had been everything she wanted. She hugged me back hard and said, "Don't go yet, Mum." I said I was tired, which was true. I said I would call her in the morning. She said, "I love you." I said, "I love you too," and I meant it. And then I got my coat and walked to my car in the vineyard parking lot under a sky full of stars and drove back to my hotel in Penticton. I sat in the hotel room for a long time without turning on the lights. I thought about the past 18 months. The deposits and the vendor calls and the Tuesday afternoons I had spent on the phone sorting out a linen rental problem that had nothing to do with my actual life. I thought about the conversation in the vineyard, walking the aisle, when Stephanie had said she did not know what she would have done without me. I thought about how I had not wanted thanks. That was true, and it is still true. But there is a difference between not needing thanks and being actively erased. There is a meaningful difference between humility and invisibility, and I had not understood, until that night, that other people might not be able to see it. I called my sister. She answered on the second ring. She said, "I've been waiting." I told her I was all right. She said, "I know you are. You always are. That doesn't mean what happened wasn't wrong." I said I knew that too. We talked for 40 minutes, and at the end of it she said, "So what are you going to do?" And I said I wasn't sure yet, and that was honest. I did not sleep much. By 6 in the morning, I was sitting in the hotel chair with a cup of bad coffee from the room machine, watching the light come up over the valley, and something had shifted in me the way things shift after a long, cold night. Not into anger, into clarity. I had made a plan for my estate about 3 years earlier, when I sold 2 of my firm's satellite offices and came into a significant amount of capital. The plan was straightforward. The Kelowna house would go to Stephanie, along with a trust structured to pay out over 10 years. There was also a commercial property I still held in Vernon, which I had intended to sign over to her outright. And there were my investments, which I will not enumerate here, but which were substantial enough that my financial advisor had made a small sound of satisfaction when we reviewed them. I had been meaning to update the documents. I had been meaning to do many things. I called my lawyer at 8:30 on a Monday morning, 2 days after the wedding, when I was back in Kelowna and sitting at my own kitchen table with proper coffee. His name is Robert Sinclair, and he has been my lawyer for 19 years, and he is not the kind of man who asks unnecessary questions. I told him I needed to make some changes to my estate documents and that I wanted to do it promptly. He said he could see me Thursday. I said Thursday was fine. I also called my financial advisor. I restructured the investment accounts so that the beneficiary designations no longer flowed automatically to Stephanie. This was not a decision made in anger. I want to be clear about that. I did not sit in that hotel room seething and plotting. I sat quietly and thought about what I actually believed, at 63, about the relationship I had with my daughter, and whether the version of that relationship I had been tending for 36 years matched the version she and Derek were apparently living. I thought about what Ray Pallister's name meant now, in that room full of people, versus what my name meant. I thought about the florist and the caterer and the tent. I thought about the vineyard and the view of the lake. I thought about a lot of things. On Thursday, I sat across from Robert in his office on Pandosi Street, and we went through the documents together. The house in Kelowna was removed from the estate plan. The Vernon property was redirected to a charitable foundation I had established some years earlier for rural arts education. The trust structure was dissolved. I did not remove Stephanie entirely. I left her a sum that was meaningful and fair and that reflected what I believed a parent owes a child who is grown and solvent and capable of building her own life. But the bulk of what I had spent 30 years accumulating was redistributed toward things and people who had not publicly diminished me. Robert did not comment on any of this except to say, at the end of the meeting, "Is there anything else you need?" I said no. He said, "All right then." We shook hands and I left. I did not call Stephanie that week. She called me on the Wednesday after the wedding, sounding bright and just back from 2 days of a mini honeymoon in Tofino, and she talked about the rain and the seafood and how Derek had surprised her with a couples massage, and I listened and made the appropriate sounds and asked the appropriate questions, and we talked for 25 minutes, and I did not mention the speech. I was not ready to, and I also was not certain what I wanted the conversation to accomplish. A month passed. In November, I had Stephanie and Derek over for dinner. I made the roast chicken she had loved since she was small. with the lemon and the herbs from the garden, and I opened a bottle of Okanagan Red that I had been saving, and we sat at the table and talked about their new apartment and Derek's promotion at work and a trip they were thinking about taking to Portugal in the spring. It was a pleasant evening. Derek helped clear the table without being asked, which I noticed. He told a funny story about a miscommunication with a client that made me laugh despite myself. Stephanie looked happy. She looked genuinely happy, and that was not nothing. After dinner, when Derek was in the living room with his phone, Stephanie found me at the kitchen sink and stood beside me drying the dishes I handed her, and she said, quietly, "Mum, about Derek's speech." I kept washing. She said, "I noticed. I should have said something to him beforehand. I didn't, and that was my fault, and I'm sorry." I handed her a wet bowl and waited. She said, "He just gets nervous and forgets things. It wasn't intentional. He felt terrible about it afterward." I said, "Did he tell you he felt terrible, or are you inferring that?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He mentioned it." I said, "Stephanie, I don't need a speech at my daughter's wedding. I'm not someone who needs to be acknowledged in front of a crowd. But there is something uncomfortable about watching the man my daughter married thank his parents for making the day possible when I'm the one who paid for the caterer and the flowers and the tent and the venue deposit." I kept my voice even. I was not performing calm. I was actually calm. "I'm not asking him to grovel. I'm asking you to understand that what happened was not nothing." She said, "I know, Mum. I know it wasn't nothing." I handed her the last dish. I pulled the drain. I said, "Good." We did not speak of it again that evening. Derek, to his credit, called me 2 days later. He sounded uncomfortable in the way that honest people sound uncomfortable when they know they have done something wrong. He said he had been thinking about the speech, and he knew he had left me out entirely and that it had been thoughtless, and he was sorry. He said he had been nervous and had gone off the notes he had written, and when he panicked at the microphone, he had defaulted to what he knew, which was his own family. He said, "You did more for that wedding than anyone, and I didn't acknowledge it, and that was wrong." I thanked him for calling. I said I appreciated it. I meant both things. What I did not tell him was that I had already been to see Robert. I did not tell him that the Vernon property had been redirected, or that the trust had been dissolved, or that the beneficiary designations had been changed. I did not tell him because it was not relevant to the apology he was making, and because the changes I had made were not a punishment designed to hurt him. They were a recalibration based on information I had finally received about my own life. Let me explain what I mean by that. For 36 years, I had operated under a certain understanding of my role. I was the provider, yes, but I had always told myself that the providing was secondary to the relationship, that the money was just the mechanism and the love was the thing that mattered. I believed that. I still believe it. But the speech at the wedding had pulled back a curtain, not on Derek specifically, not even on Stephanie entirely, but on an assumption I had been carrying without examining it. The assumption that my contribution to this family was understood, was seen, was woven into the fabric of how they thought about themselves and their life together. That assumption had been wrong, or at the very least, it had been untested. And I was 63 years old, and I had spent 31 years in business, and the one lesson business teaches you, reliably and without sentiment, is that untested assumptions are liabilities. I did not stop loving my daughter. I did not stop having dinner with her, or answering her calls, or caring about whether she was happy. None of that changed. What changed was the architecture of my planning. What changed was the degree to which my financial future, and hers, was structured around an emotional understanding that I could no longer take on faith. I also quietly sold the Kelowna house. Not quickly, not dramatically. I listed it in the spring and sold it in June to a couple from Calgary who wanted to retire to the Okanagan, which I found fitting in a way I could not entirely explain. I moved into a smaller place on the east side of the city, a condominium with a balcony that faces the lake, which I find I prefer. Biscuit adjusted within a week. I called it a downsizing. Stephanie called it a surprise. I told her I was simplifying, which was true. Derek found out about the Vernon property in February through a conversation he apparently had with a mutual contact in the commercial real estate community. He called me on a Saturday morning, and his voice had lost some of its ease. He said, "Lorraine, I heard you redirected the Vernon property. Is that right?" I said it was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Was that because of the speech?" I said, "Derek, the Vernon property was always mine to direct as I saw fit. I directed it towards something I care about. That's the whole story." He said, "I want to understand if we did something that hurt you in a way that's still—" I said, "You made a mistake at a microphone in October. You called me and apologized for it, and I accepted. Those two things are both true, and they don't cancel each other out." I paused. "What I choose to do with my own assets is a separate matter. I hope you can understand that." He said he could. He did not sound entirely convinced, but he said it. Stephanie called me that evening. Her voice was careful in a way I recognized, the voice she uses when she is trying to be reasonable about something that is bothering her. She said, "Mom, Derek told me about the Vernon property." I said, "I figured he might." She said, "Can I ask what happened?" I thought that was going to. She stopped. She started again. "I thought that was part of the plan." I said, "Plans change, sweetheart. I'm 63, not 83. I still have time to revise." She said, "Is this about the wedding?" I said, "It's about me, taking stock of where I am and what I want to do with what I've built. That's not a punishment. That's just what grown people do." There was a long pause. Then she said, "I feel like I'm being punished." I said, gently, "I understand why it might feel that way, and I'm sorry it feels that way. But feeling punished and being punished are different things, and I need you to sit with that for a little while." She cried a little. I stayed on the line. I told her I loved her. I told her that nothing about my love for her had changed, not one fraction of it, and that I would be at her door with roast chicken whenever she needed me. I told her that I was her mother, and that was permanent and unconditional. But I also told her that I was a person who had worked for 31 years and that what I had built belonged to me, and that I was going to make thoughtful decisions about it with clear eyes, and that those decisions were not a referendum on our relationship. They were just decisions. She said, "I hear you." I said, "Good." We talked for another half hour about other things. The trip to Portugal, a problem she was having with a colleague at work, whether I thought she should get a dog. By the time we hung up, something had eased between us. Not entirely, not permanently, but enough. The missed calls came in March. Not from Stephanie. From Derek. It turned out that the commercial contact he had spoken to in February had also mentioned, in passing, something about the investment account restructuring. Derek had done some arithmetic. He called me 6 times on a Thursday evening, starting at 7 and going until 10:30. I was at Margaret's for dinner and I saw the calls come in and I let them go. I called him back the next morning. He said, "I've been trying to reach you." I said, "I know. I was with my sister." He said, "I need to understand what's happening here, Lorraine, because I'm looking at the picture and it's not what I thought it was." I said, "What picture did you think you were looking at?" He said, "I thought Stephanie thought that there was a plan for the future, for security. We made decisions based on that." I said, "What decisions?" He paused. Then he said, "We bought the apartment." I said, "You bought a very nice apartment that you can afford on your combined incomes. You both have good jobs, Derek. You're 39 years old." He said, "We stretched, Lorraine. We stretched because we thought—" I said, "Because you thought you knew what my estate plan looked like." Silence. I said, "Derek, I want to ask you something, and I'd like you to think about it honestly before you answer. At the wedding, when you were thanking your parents, what were you thinking?" He did not answer right away. I said, "You don't have to answer. I'm not asking so I can use it against you. I'm asking because I think it might be useful for you to know the answer yourself." He said quietly, "I think I just defaulted to what I knew." I said, "Yes, I think that's right. And I think I've spent 36 years being the thing people default to without thinking. The backup, the safety net, the thing you don't mention in the speech because it's always just there." I kept my voice even. "I'm not angry, Derek. I want you to hear that. I'm not calling to fight with you or to tell you that you're a bad person, because I don't think you are. I'm calling to tell you that the safety net made a decision about itself, and that's allowed." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Is there anything we can do?" I said, "Keep making Stephanie happy. That's what I want. Keep being someone she can count on. That's worth more to me than anything in any of those documents." He said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." We hung up. I sat at the kitchen table with Biscuit's head on my foot and the morning light coming through the window, and I felt, for the first time in months, that the accounting was correct. Not the financial accounting. The other kind. The one where you know what things cost and what they're worth, and the two numbers finally match. I think often now about what it means to love someone without condition and still maintain yourself. I spent a long time believing those two things were in opposition. That to love fully, you had to give fully, and to give fully meant giving without reservation or inventory or boundary. I was wrong about that. I was wrong for 36 years, and the correction arrived on a Tuesday night in October in a room full of candlelight and autumn flowers, delivered by a nervous man in a nice suit who simply forgot I existed. I do not blame Derek for who he is. I do not even blame Stephanie entirely, because the truth is I trained her. I trained everyone around me to take the ground beneath their feet for granted by making sure it never moved. I kept showing up. I kept providing. I kept saying it was fine, it was nothing, don't worry about it. And when you do that long enough, people believe you. Why wouldn't they? The lesson I carry now is not about withholding. It is not about making people prove themselves before you extend care. It is simpler and harder than that. It is about knowing your own value while you still have time to live inside that knowledge, not for the speeches, not for the public acknowledgement, for yourself, privately, in the morning light, with your coffee and your dog and your view of the lake. I am 63. I have revised my plans and reorganized my home and learned something true about my life late enough that it cost me something, but early enough that it changed me, rather than just confirming what I suspected. I talk to Stephanie every week. She is trying, and so am I, and I think we will be all right. Derek still calls. Less often now, but he calls. He asked me last month if I wanted to come for dinner on a Sunday, and I said yes, and I brought wine and stayed 3 hours, and we talked about Portugal, which they had finally booked for April. I did not bring roast chicken. I let her cook this time. There is something worth remembering in all of this, not just for mothers, not just for women who have spent decades being the one everyone counts on, but for anyone who has ever confused being reliable with being invisible. The people who never make demands are often the ones whose contributions disappear first from the record. This is not a reason to make more demands. It is a reason to be intentional about the record. To know what you have given, to give it on your own terms, and to build a life that does not depend on someone else noticing. You can love generously and still belong to yourself. You can be someone's safety net and still decide what the net is made of. You can forgive completely and still change the terms. Those things are not contradictions. They are the whole of it. Stephanie knows now that her mother is not a backdrop. I think she knew before, somewhere, but now it is not a thing she can forget. And honestly, I think that is better for both of us. The lake looks different in the mornings from the new balcony. Wider, somehow, more like mine.